kind of a health check, a kind of a preventive mechanism to make sure that the overall objectives of the organizations are met. In that context, we have a kind of a service which takes care from a preventive risk mechanism, which is a fraud risk assessment. A fraud risk assessment typically talks about an organization's identification of risk, analysis of risk, evaluation of risk, treating the risk, monitoring and reviewing the risk. In a way, we can say that it is a kind of close to the philosophy of prevention being better than cure. So, since more and more expenses, impropriety, more and more sanctions which are being given by the government, they also have to be seen in the light whether there has not been any impropriety conduct, there has not been any kind of unwarranted outflows. So from that angle, a kind of a preventive mechanism is the need of the hour India in the Indian corporates. Because most of the Indian corporates where we see basically have less kind of a framework and more of a kind of mechanism driven by the officials rather than having it listed in a documentation format. We typically talk about an internal control environment, which is a kind of a corporate governance structure, which says that in order to have an organization met its objectives and expand its growth, we need to have a reliable financial reporting system so that in compliance with the applicable laws, the assets and the interest of the stakeholders and the concerned personnel are met. Having said that, why a kind of a risk management process is important, as I mentioned earlier, identification of a risk for a particular company is very important. Which are the key processes it wants to take care of? It wants to see that these are the vulnerable processes which possibly can have subsequent risk exposure. So from that standpoint, we need to have that identification leading to analysis, then evaluation, treating the risk, monitoring and reviewing the risk, then automatically giving the recommendations. Typically when we talk about fraud, so it has two ways to it. One is a preventive mechanism, other is a detective mechanism. While we are talking about a preventive mechanism, which is a kind of setting up fraud risk framework, doing health check data analytics, which we'll more talk in detail when I'll take you through the rest of the services which we have. Having said that, investigation is a part which automatically comes if there is some kind of an event which has happened and there's a post facto scrutiny which needs to be done. Typically, when a fraud happens, everyone as a kind of, in terms of understanding the fraud, we need to also understand the person who has conducted the fraud, to understand the psyche, what goes behind doing a fraud. So there are three aspects to it which are connected by a fourth triangle, wherein we talk about a pressure, we talk about rationalization, we talk about an opportunity. The pressure basically is that in case an individual is in a key position but having some kind of a financial distress. Now that is a pressure which creates or which compels the person to think in that direction. An opportunity would be that you don't have an existence of a good or robust internal control framework. You have subsequent substantial process gaps which can lead the individual to violate and to take advantage of those gaps in the organization. And rationalization, every individual whomsoever is conducting a fraud will definitely give you a substantial reason for validation that this is why I conducted this activity. So typically, more than understanding the fraud framework, it is also important to understand the psyche of a fraudster as to what exactly happens in the mind of a fraudster when a fraud is being conducted. It is very important that, like in course of the engagements which we've seen that senior people, it's not only at a junior level. We have seen people at the middle management, at a senior management also falling prey to the kind of a possible exposure. in terms of having a comfort in their roles and responsibilities and having risks not being addressed timely. And the organization is not looking for a rotation of responsibilities, not looking into developing or updation of the standard operating procedures, which is the need of the hour. The emerging concerns, like I talked about, when we have fraud, so definitely it would involve subsequent expenses, expense monitoring, which is in fact one of the most common areas which we see. So we have cash expenses, we have travel costs, we have indirect costs, assets misutilization, scrap sales, and reporting. Talking about the cash expenses, any kind of an expense which is done in cash, it is open to forgery and it is open to ending up in a fictitious claim. Because as we understand, cash is a fungible item. You cannot, if in the recent, I would say, regulatory changes in India, where we had earlier the NPA audits, then we have the insolvency restructuring. The main focus by the government has been to establish the money trail, to see the diversion of funds. What exactly happens is that eventually if some transactions are being routed through bank accounts and then subsequently routed through other, they are still easily, I would say, in a way to being traced. However, if any expense has been done in cash, then establishing a trail and ensuring a propriety to that effect is almost impossible. So what exactly we should see, we should minimize the usage of cash expenses, even if you have any course of your daily operational activities to the minimum extent, because that would help you to make sure that you are not giving any fodder to the person to commit a fraud subsequently. Travel costs would always, whenever there's a travel requirement, we do partner with different vendors. Having said that, most of the vendors in organizations, they are whenever we do internal audits or whenever we do a vendor performance evaluation, a vendor management exercise, we just get the comments from the companies that these are tried and tested vendors. While we don't discount their credibility, having said that, for travel vendors, if you are indulging with them and a backup of the vendor as well as a vendor performance evaluation at the end of every year is definitely required, whether that particular vendor is effective for your organization and you are having that annual assessment being done or not. Indirect costs, where an arm's length assessment is required, prices might be, it is a competitive scenario in the Indian market. I would say any service you talk about, you have multiple players, multiple level of players are in the market willing to give you services at lower rates. You have to see whether the services, even if they are being given or even if they are being referred by anyone, does the recommendation have any kind of conflict of interest between the vendor and the employee? Because that is very important, because if possibly a fraud happens, it happens by virtue of a collusion. So if you have got someone into the system which might be offering rates at a lower, or services at a lower rate, but is it at the right quality? That also has to be assessed. From the assets misappropriation part, every organization has normally an ethics and compliance policy. Every organization has that. However, having said that, in the Indian context, what actually happens is that the revision of that policy does not happen. And what more than when an employee joins the organization, at the time of induction, most people are not even aware what assets they have. Basically, they are in hold of company's assets, such as the laptop, such as if the company has given them a mobile. So those assets ultimately, as to how they have to be used, that also has to be seen. In course of the presentation, we'll see that there has been cases where there have been theft of assets, or there have been loss of proprietary information of the company through misusage of those assets. So that aspect has to be seen. Scrap sales is basically valuation, making sure that the valuation of scrap, because scrap management in the manufacturing industry is a very big term. A lot of, I would say, a miscellaneous income is generated through scrap sales. So that aspect has to be seen from a fraud perspective, and reporting, obviously from a audit standpoint, any kind of an expenses, camouflage or missing documentation or resulted to any bribery, that is an emerging area of concern. The business risk where we talked about, so typically if we talk about different industries, like supposedly an infrastructure or supposedly any kind of a manufacturing concern, the main part lies if they are typically 4 or 5 processes which in the overall context which are vulnerable to risk. One would be surely procurement of goods and services. So you might be having situations where a vendor empanelment is being done, but having said that, has the background verification for the vendor being done in detail? Because if not, then you can have a bid rigging exercise and subsequent manipulation. I'll explain this with an instance. In one of the engagements we were asked to, which was a leading infrastructure player in India, we were asked to do a vendor performance evaluation exercise. What we found is that while awarding the contracts for building highways in India, in different parts of the country, there were only 2 vendors, preferred vendors in the overall cycle, which was a part of the cartel. Because as a part of the bidding exercise, the other 3 were not even cross-checked or referenced by the people who were selecting them. So when we did that exercise, because there was a kind of an allegation or a suspicion of vendor favoritism, when we looked into those 3 parties, we found that they were not in the line of business for which they were submitting the bids. So a kind of a bid rigging exercise is very important to evaluate, because an overall corporate intelligence check on the entity as well as the directors is very important to be done. This is highly impactful and moderately common. Then we have the misappropriation of assets and vendor frauds, which we've talked about in a way. Then we have drafting deficiencies, version control, communication and retention. So in a way, what exactly we should always see that whenever you have any kind of a structure being made for a process, the documentation trail to that effect should be complete and it should be validated. Most of the times the documentation is taken, but are we seeing whether the documentation which has been submitted, like in this case for a vendor, is it genuine? Are we seeing the quality? Most of the times you might see if in organizations they have a kind of a vendor rigging exercise, the fonts on the paper, they are similar. If someone would look with an eye for detail, the fonts on the paper, they appear to be similar. Or they would not be having the regulatory information. They would not be having the mobile contacts. So these things have to be seen with precision, and that should raise a red flag that at least why the complete information has not been given when you are taking the documentation from the parties. High impact and highly common categories, we have cash skimming, larceny, forged and fictitious expense claims, and unauthorized credit. Forged and fictitious expense claims normally happens when the monitoring of the expenses is very important in today's scenario, because whenever even if there have been sanctions given by government or for a particular project, they have to be seen in the light whether the expenses they are justified or fake submission of bills have been just given to make sure that the consumption of budget is happening. That is very important and I would say, a particular aspect to be seen to. Then we have bribery, corruption, policy influence, and conflict of interest. Conflict of interest typically talks about when a particular employee is trying to profiteer from the sources of the company in a way that when vendors are aligned or they have related party relationships, supposedly a procurement manager is working in a company and the vendor is an associated concern, associated relative, and the background verification of that particular entity, if it is selected, has not been done, then definitely it would result to a kind of conflict of interest and a bribery and corruption scenario. So while what we've spoken about in course of the presentation up till now, so the root causes of concerns would definitely lie on lack of periodical review, which we are talking about, inadequate background checks, which is the key requirement of the hour, because as we were going through the presentation in the morning, the government is also talking about having significant beneficial ownership checks done as mandated by the MCA. Now this is actually in a line of lifting the corporate veil and coming down strongly on the shell companies, because in a way whenever there have been any non-performing assets or right now insolvency reviews. So they are companies which are being held by the main people who are into the corruption practices, but under different names. So that aspect, if you have a definite background check done, that aspect would be covered. A weak vigil mechanism, because an absence of whistleblower and a vigil mechanism will take care. Having said that, while it might not be preventive, but definitely it would be detective, because if you have that structure, so based on whatever outcomes are coming from the investigation, which the vigil mechanism would trigger, then ultimately you can have some more robust controls built in. The important part which I talked about was relying too much on the manpower, where we say that lack of review managers' performance to see adequate discharge of duties. In my earlier conversation, I talked about rotation of responsibilities. Now, this is a very important aspect why people at the top management, they feel that the credibility of people who have spent a tenure in the firm, that is there. But having said that, as a consulting organization, we are, as much as we value the credibility and the tenure spent in the organization, we would also like to talk and see from a risk management framework that the rotation of responsibilities is being done, because that ultimately makes the person more effective and ultimately the company exposed to a lesser risk. And last but not the least, we have this conflicting auditors' role and lack of independence. This is basically a kind of a scenario wherein an audit firm possibly might be providing non-audit services. But having said that, while the Chartered Accountant Institute is now ensuring more compliance effects to that, so that those things, I think so, would be a thing of the past. The typical techniques which are concerned by the companies which have to be seen, which are into cost benchmarking, tracing of assets, e-discovery, setting up a whistleblower program, through market intelligence, having an internal audit, and ERM. So a cost benchmarking exercise would definitely give you the advantage with whether are you paying too less or too more, which would give you that you have the sufficient amount with the requisite quality with the right paramount cost set. Tracking of asset, tracing of assets, physical verification. Most of the times you have in a large structure companies, you have assets being there, but they are not physically tagged. The tagging of assets is an important activity which obviously needs to be done. And e-discovery and identify. Normally, as I said in course of my conversation, that most of the assets which are being taken by companies, they are seen to be personal assets, whereas that is not the case, because they are the assets of the company. So a lot of mail communication, and in typically these kind of scenarios where you are indulging with vendors, a lot of mail communication happens, which obviously helps us to do an investigation. So that is where an e-discovery activity we do, where we identify the fraudulent activities and if they have exchanged any communication. Having a whistleblower program is obviously important, because once you have an ethics and compliance policy structured, then a whistleblower program will at least take care that what a preventive measure could not do for you, at least a detective mechanism is helping you to nip the bud. A market intelligence activity is more than the financial assessment. Normally in audits we do see that we do have financial assessments being done. Market intelligence activity gives you the pulse of the market, as well as gives you an overall idea of the malpractices which are happening, which your company or any potential company the fraudster might be targeting to. Internal audit is an important aspect to make sure that the processes and the framework is in place. And ARM, an end-to-end enterprise risk management solution, would definitely make sure that you have the overall gaps and leakages negated. This is, while in course of the presentation we have 4 cases where we'll tell you that where exactly and how typically a fraud happens, which we should be looking into. Now this is a case where we do have invoice which has been received. We see that a typical invoice would definitely be legible, it would be clean. But however, if you look at the pictures and the observations would cite that you have overwriting on bills, handwritten bills. So any manual intervention, if that happens, then obviously that will give you a kind of a discomfort in today's scenario, wherein possibly either the rates are not measured, they have not been mapped correctly. If they have been, as I mentioned earlier, if they have been with regulatory information, they have been without a kind of a GST, or even if the GST is mentioned, just for the sake of filling the nomenclature, you have the numbers mentioned, but that is not actually the GST number if a verification of that is done. So any kind of a payment which is coming to us or to any organization, that should be seen with an eye for detail rather than just merely understanding or thinking that you have a vendor agreement or any kind of an agreement with the party and these are all eligible expenses. In a bidding scenario, as I mentioned, most of the frauds typically happen in a bidding scenario, in a procurement function, wherein in a bidding function, in a bidding setup, either the loss of information is happening, wherein the bid rate at which the company is quoting, those are being leaked, or possibly some of the vendors which are part of a bid rigging, they are not genuine. So in this particular case where we are talking about, there was a particular company which was having a reasonable turnover into and was earning income from PSU tenders. Having said that, the closest competitor was actually having a success rate of winning the tenders vis-a-vis the earlier company, and they were participating for the same setup. Overall, looking into the aspect of why this loss is happening to the earlier company, there appeared to be a situation wherein there was a kind of a data leakage about the bids, which was giving the second company obviously the competitive advantage. So a kind of I would say a robust mechanism that was absent, which could not help the company to prevent this. Ultimately, what exactly from a fraud angle, what we should do is we should basically see that if a fraud analytics is being done, then which period have been the reasonable failures, and if we could handle that particular aspect through any discovery, disimaging activity of target employees which are suspected to be a part of the racket. An vendor-employee collusion, which I was talking about, that is typical and that is very common, wherein we see that the employees are either connected to the organizations in more ways than one, and that actually happens if the rotation of responsibility in the role is not happening. So rates, arm's length pricing, if the rates have been booked by a particular vendor more than the rate at which it should have been done, that independent assessment is the requirement which needs to be seen. Legal deficiencies and weak documentation, as I said, the documentation trail has to be very, very perfect while having any contractual agreements. So while a typical scenario would entail that you have a requirement with the vendor, you need, before even approaching the vendor or people you've raised any kind of RFP to the vendors, the credibility of the paperwork and the regulatory information should actually be a pinpoint and should be a kind of a prerequisite which should be mentioned in the RFP, that in case of any kind of insufficient or inadequate information is there to that effect, that would result in cancellation of the contract. For a leadership, for people at the helm of affairs, what exactly are we saying that frauds, why they should, how you can prevent them, to the point that how robust are the controls and policies in the organization. The point which we've been talking about is that you need to have it is more people-centric driven. In India, processes are more people-centric driven. People have been at the helm of affairs for a long period of time. They feel that they know the process better. With due respect to that, having said that, but if supposedly you have a new hire in the organization, how do you expect the person to scale up? The scaling up will definitely happen because of you have a documented structure, and definitely based on the control mechanism which will be built in that documentation, which will reduce the possible risk if tomorrow it happens. Has the organization identified the potential frauds? That is a very, very key scenario. Whatever is intrinsic to the business, whatever is the main revenue, whatever are the main expense heads, they need to be very, very clearly distinguished. And that is where the potential frauds scenarios, if there's a possibility, they need to be understood by the management. How do you know the vendors? Has any background check being done? How are the vendors, employees, another organization placed as compared to industry standards? We talked in the fraud angle about the financial part. If there is a financial distress, if a benchmarking of employees has not happened, a cost to comparison market of their remuneration structure is not happening, then possibly that is one of an indication which might lead to a fraud activity. What functions, processes they have key bearing on the organization. Any typical organization, if the key people are a part of a particular important function, then that visibility should be there as to what exactly happens in that function, rather than it being operating in silos. To what extent are the analytical and substantive procedures of stat auditors and internal auditors focused towards relying potential frauds? Obviously, an ongoing activity. Stat auditors' activity is important to give an opinion, whereas an internal auditor would definitely try to unearth any kind of process gaps within the processes. A business continuity planning mechanism needs to be there. Supposingly, an employee with a good tenure in the organization has a lot of proprietary data. One day that employee resigns or moves to a competitive organization. Is someone in the organization having the backup of that data? That is very important. Otherwise, that leads to a loss of proprietary information. In most of the IT companies, they don't even allow pen drives, they don't even allow your mobile phones to be there, because obviously when they are attending into meetings or conferences or in normal seminars, the point is that in course of the working, the data which is there in the organization, that is their own. So no one can ever think of using a pen drive to unearth any kind of data, or they have laptops which do not allow that kind of an extraction. Is my organization compliant under FCPA, UK bribery and ABC laws? Bribery in a fraud angle, when it talks about personal profiteering, so bribery is definitely an incident to it, which definitely would be there. So if there is a compliance with the laws and regulations that is required, then definitely this angle needs to be done. And our entity level policies in place and related trainings, entity level policies which we were talking about, having an ethics and compliance policy and related trainings, making your people aware. Someone is coming into an organization, is being given a laptop. The person has to be told that please do not have your personal data here, because this is only for official consumption. For people, for consultants, whether we'll be able to justify the due diligence, whether we have a scope of work listed based on the requirements, have we understood the management's appetite to fraud in case there's not much of a robust fraud framework in the organization? What services can we give? We cannot definitely give them a more ambitious services like we'll do a kind of fault finding exercise in your organization. Rather, we'll try from setting up of a standard operating procedure for them. How do you rate each business department? Transparency of information is important. Stepping into the forensic hat, given the controlled environment, would you, where you find it easy to take money or the information out from the company, relying on some professional system, or do you, in case you discover fraud by leadership? In India, typically, by this time, since most of them are ventures of MNCs as well, typically, any kind of a leadership fraud, we do have internal risk teams now in different organizations. The forensic services which we are talking about, we have this list of forensic services portfolio, which have typically 8 services. From a high sensitivity point in an Indian market, an investigation, a risk assessment, anti-bribery compliance, a technology service setup, corporate intelligence, debugging, and insolvency. Insolvency, we've been talking about in course of a discussion where they were earlier in PAs, and now with the IBC code, a lot of insolvency work is being done. So that we can also be useful in that arena. This is a health check review we were talking about from a preventive data analytics standpoint, where I was mentioning that even though you might be having an internal audit team internally, but then this needs to be done to make sure that you are up to date with the vulnerabilities in your system, what exactly they are existing as of now. Investigation is a post facto exercise where we talk about if a whistleblower, any kind of an activity which has happened, any organization which wants us to look into the same, we can take care of. A fraud risk assessment is a preventive measure, and which typically talks about setting up of a whistleblower helpline. Because obviously if you have a kind of a mechanism where you want people to be made aware, then you need to have a whistleblower helpline, which is a part of the ethics compliance structure. Design a fraud management and monitoring framework. Improve the monitoring mechanism because it's a continuous exercise. Hidden fraud awareness among staff and board members. In the earlier part of the presentation, we were talking about training to people. This is the part where you need to train people, make them aware so that no one can say tomorrow that possibly we weren't aware or there wasn't a part of negligence at our end. And structure customized trainings to management staff, management team and staff. That is an ongoing activity. Anti-bribery compliance, wherever you have the legislation impact, from that point you need to look into this service. We can provide this service. Why it is important? Because it has a lot of reputational damage attached. If any organization has been reported that it has indulged or it basically had a case of bribing officials, and that is very important to be seen, because in the light of that, a lot of fines, penalties would be definitely imposed going by the framework of the law. Forensic technology solutions is the part where we are talking about retrieval of information from employees, which is a part of the investigations. Debugging services is again loss of proprietary information, which in case if it happens from organizations. Insolvency and restructuring as per the IBC code. This is a kind of a framework wherein if a forensic audit needs to be done by an insolvency resolution professional if they want, then they have to abide with the different parts to it, be it a preferential transaction or undervalued transaction or transaction defrauding creditors, any extortionate credit transactions, fraudulent transactions, and identifying disqualified bidders. Corporate intelligence, this is the most important part, because when we started the presentation, we have been harping on the fact of having a background verification done, having a due diligence done. This is the most important part, because in any kind of a fraud scenario, if you have a preventive background activity, background check activity, most of your risks are minimized. Why it is important and where you can look into the services where any kind of background verifications are required, any third-party risk assessment. In infrastructure industry, you have liaising with many third parties. Are we doing enough? Are we being smart in making sure that we have the know-how of the party we are dealing with, whether they have the credibility and the credentials to deliver the services? That is important. Asset tracing and social media analysis is more driven from a part. Asset tracing is important from an insolvency standpoint, because what exactly has happened in India, a lot of laundering of funds and diversion of funds which have been taken from banks, that has happened, and the proprietors and the key personnel, they have profiteered as a result of it. So at one angle, while the organization says that we don't have money, but having said that, if someone conducts an asset tracing of their personal wealth, they have created assets over a period of time. So that activity is a part of the market intelligence process, and that is very important to be done. Social media analysis is to check the conflict of interest. We can look into the services where you are having any acquisitions or any investment into a new business, when you are hiring employees at a senior level, because again that is a very important activity to be done. Recruitment of vendors, dealers, again from a third party's perspective, or venturing into any kind of a foreign market setup to understand the market, how does the market operate. Different databases through which this activity is being done. Other services basically are what we can offer is grant audits, scrap validation, project management, which we've spoken about, MIS, information technology services. So having said that, while we do have the ability and we do understand the sensitivity to different service, it is actually also important for the organizations to understand as to which is more critical for them so that they can reach out to us and we can offer services suitably from our end. Thank you.